Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our guest here with us today, David Rubenstein. He's an investor, a philanthropist, an interviewer, author, and a noted historian. He's the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms. It was established back in 1987. Carlyle now manages $447 billion from 29 offices around the world. David is a Baltimore native and is the chairman, CEO, and the principal owner of our beloved Baltimore Orioles. He's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, chairman of the board of many, many organizations, too many to list here today. We're going to be here another hour. He's a leader in the area of patriotic philanthropy, having made many transformative gifts. He's an original signer of the Giving Pledge, which we're going to talk about. He's the host of the David Rubenstein Show, Bloomberg Wealth with David Rubenstein, and Iconic America. He's the author of 5 books entitled The American Story, How to Lead, The American Experiment, How to Invest, and The Highest Calling. Please welcome everybody, David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
David, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's an honor and a privilege to have you here. I wonder, first of all, if you could maybe walk us back in time a little bit and tell us, how does a young guy living in an approximate 800 square foot house, father's working in the post office as a file clerk, your mother's working in a dress shop, how do you go from Baltimore City High School, college, to Duke, and then to law school, and then within a couple years, you're chief counsel to the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. Senate on one of the subcommittees. And then a couple years after that, in your mid to late 20s, you're a policy advisor to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. How do you have the confidence that a 20-year-old can advise the President, or should I say, how do you have the chutzpah to carry that off?
Well, I didn't do very well because we got inflation of 19%, so maybe I shouldn't have been doing that. Look, I was very lucky, as all of you know. Luck is an important part of life. A lot of things happen by serendipity. My parents were blue-collar workers. My father dropped out of high school to go into World War II. We came back. He met my mother. They got married. I was their only child, and he worked in the post office his entire life. And he retired at what seemed like an unseemly young age then, and even younger now. He was 55, and he moved to a suburb of Baltimore, West Palm Beach, Florida. And I got lucky. I was interested. I had no interest in making money. I grew up in a blue-collar family. It was very small part of Baltimore. It was kind of a Jewish ghetto area. I didn't know anybody who wasn't Jewish till I was about 12. I thought everybody in the world was Jewish, and I realized later that virtually nobody's Jewish. But it was very segregated because, as you all probably know if you're from Baltimore, Baltimore was probably the most rigidly segregated city in the United States by religion. And if you were Jewish, you lived in a very narrow area called Northwest Baltimore, later Pikesville. And the same was true if you were African American, you had to live in certain parts of Baltimore, because while the Supreme Court outlawed what was called a restrictive covenant in 1948, Baltimore never quite got the word. And so people still lived in certain areas, and you weren't supposed to move in other areas. And so all of my relatives lived within, a half a block of my house, very small house. And, there's an advantage. If you grow up in a blue-collar environment and you want to make something of yourself, you obviously have the incentive to work harder. If you grow up in a very, very wealthy family, you may not have the incentive to work as hard. So I had the advantage of growing up in a family where if I was going to get anywhere, I had to do it on my own, and I got lucky. I had some good teachers and so forth, and a lot of luck. But I would say, I'm very pleased that I got where I am, but it was not because I was interested in making money. I just had no interest in making money. I was really interested in serving in the government.
Let's talk about that. Jimmy Carter, unfortunately, in 1980, did not get reelected. You technically, at that time, were out of a job and unemployed. What did you tell your mother?
Well, I told Carter that he couldn't possibly lose to Reagan because Reagan was so old. He was 69 years old. I thought at that time that seemed really old to me. Now it seems like a teenager to me. Carter was at the time 56 years old. He was elected when he was 52, left when he was 56, and he never really quite recovered from what happened. He couldn't believe he had lost to Reagan, and then he remade his life. He was president only 4 years, and an ex-president, former president, for 44 years, and during that period of time, he did some incredible things. I had to remake my life as well because I had expected to be the senior domestic advisor in Carter's second term, and I'm sure Carter would win. We had hostages, we had high inflation, we had gas lines, we had lots of problems, but we just thought, like most White House staffs think, that their boss is actually pretty good and they will get reelected. I was wrong. So what happened was I had to go and practice law again, which is all I knew, and a lot of people didn't want to hire a Carter White House aide who was 31 years old because I didn't have any experience that was really relevant in practicing law in Washington. I didn't really know any one subject matter that well. But I didn't want to tell my mother her only son was unemployed and unemployable. So I kept saying, I have a lot of offers, I don't know which one to take. And that went on for about 6 months, and finally she said, why don't you just take one of those offers already? So I finally took one of the offers, and I started practicing law again, and I realized why I didn't like practicing law. I wasn't good at it, and clients didn't really think I was that good. And so, if you're going to get anywhere in life, you have to love what you're doing. Nobody ever won a Nobel Prize hating what they're doing. You have to love it. And I didn't really love practicing law, so I took a gamble. It could have gone the other way. I just started a firm in Washington, D.C., the first private equity firm there, and it took off to become one of the largest in the world, and I got very lucky.
Well, talk about that. Talk about the transition from law to finance to the founding of the Carlyle Group with Bill Conway. That obviously has brought you unbelievable success. The amount of money we're talking about under management, $447 billion. You got thousands of employees. You got 29 offices around the globe. How did that all happen? You just didn't snap your fingers.
Well, what happened was I came up with a couple ideas that changed the face of private equity. These don't deserve Nobel Prizes, but this is what happened. I was a young man. I was 31 years old when I left the White House. I started Carlyle when I was 37. I read that entrepreneurs will start their companies between the age of 28 and 37. And if by the age of 37 you haven't started a company, you're probably never going to do so. And I read that when I was 37, and I wasn't happy practicing law. And I read about a man named Bill Simon who had been Secretary of Treasury under Gerald Ford. And when he left as Secretary of Treasury, he went into business, and he had been previously at Salomon Brothers. And he did a buyout, something called a leveraged buyout, and he bought a Gibson greeting cards, which he put in about $1 million of his own money, and he made $80 million in 18 months. And I didn't know what a leveraged buyout was, but I figured if you can make $80 million in 18 months, I should learn more about that. So I decided to hire some people and make them as partners with me who had finance experience, who in Washington had worked at Marriott or other kind of companies that they had been in the financial world. They all had MBAs. I told them we were going to start a buyout firm in Washington, heavily focused on things affected by the U.S. government, because if I went to New York, nobody would take me seriously. Nobody took me that seriously in Washington, but I said, we're going to focus on companies affected by the federal government, aerospace, defense, telecommunications. Sounded like it made some sense. And then I said, I'll go get the money, you guys do the deals. And I didn't have any money at the beginning, and I got 4 investors at the very beginning, 2 from Baltimore, T. Rowe Price and Alex Brown, and then 2 other investors, the Mellon family and a bank in California, and we got $5 million to start. And then I did 3 things that changed private equity a bit. I made ourselves better known by going out and hiring former government officials who were much more visible than me. I brought in Frank Carlucci, former Secretary of Defense, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, George Herbert Walker Bush, President of the United States, John Major, Prime Minister of England, people like that, Arthur Levitt, head of the SEC. I brought them in, and that would enable me to get in front of investors. So if I invited any of you to a dinner that I was going to speak at in 1987, you would never show up. But I said, if you want to have dinner with George Herbert Walker Bush or me, let me know. And I get people show up. So that was a thing that changed our visibility. Secondly, private equity firms were tiny little firms in 1987. They had 5 people, 10 people. They were tiny firms. And in that time, I came up with an idea that changed the face of private equity a bit. I mean, it doesn't deserve a great prize, but this is what it was. We did buyouts, and other firms did buyouts, but I said we can do what mutual funds have done. T. Rowe Price, for example, had many funds in different areas. So we could have different funds. We have a buyout fund, a real estate fund, a venture fund, a growth capital fund, a debt fund. We could just take our brand name. If people like us in buyouts, they give us a chance in growth capital. They like us in buyouts and growth capital, give us a chance in venture and so forth. And then I decided the third thing I did was globalize it. I decided I would be willing to spend my time running around the world recruiting people in England, in Europe, Japan, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, and have funds everywhere in the world. So our brand name would be all over the world. We'd have funds that we controlled. We'd raise the money for them, and I was the principal fundraiser. And so by having multiple funds in different areas and having them global, we were able to build a gigantic firm. Now, if we had invested poorly, it wouldn't have worked. But my partners who I recruited in the beginning actually were pretty good investors, and our track record was pretty good, and all of that worked. Got lucky.
You know, you talked about that if you haven't become a business owner or whatever by the age of 37, you probably wouldn't do it. Also, I mean, Al Newhart, the founder of USA Today, talked about in his book, I think it was called Diary of an SOB, where he talked about if you haven't failed at something by the age of 40, you better hurry up and fail, because if you don't fail at something, you won't be a success.
Well, I failed at many things. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes. Carlisle should be 3 times bigger than it is today. I made a lot of mistakes, and we were ahead of other firms, and some mistakes I made, resulted us being very successful, but we're not the biggest private equity firm in the world. I thought we should have been, but I made some mistakes.
We all make mistakes, folks. David, you've written 5 books. You host 2 shows on Bloomberg TV. You're on more boards than I can imagine. I think the latest count was 23 boards, and 7 of those boards, you're chairman of the board. You know, I talk to a lot of people in the audience and people that I consult with, and I hear often I hear, well, geez, Doug, I don't have the time for this, or I don't have the time for that. You seem to have the time for everything. What's your secret in terms of time management that you allow yourself to do all this?
I'm a triplet, actually. So I have one does one thing. No, actually, I'm only doing things that I like doing and love doing, and if you love doing it, it's not work. So I have a lot of intellectual curiosity, and the interviewing thing took off, and I didn't expect it. What happened was, and at Carlisle, I wanted to bring people to the events, and I would hire famous people, former presidents of the United States, secretaries of state, to come, and they were boring speakers. So I went to the speaking agent and said, look, can I interview them? I could use some humor maybe, and maybe make it more interesting. And they said, as long as you pay the same fee, they'll do it. They don't care. So I made Hillary Clinton look funny. I made Ben Bernanke look interesting, and it wasn't easy to do. And so I figured I could do this, and then I became the head of the Economic Club of Washington. We had 100 members at the time. We had a meeting this May. We have 1,000 members now. And what happened was the business people came in to speak, and they were boring, and people were falling asleep. So I said, I'm going to junk that format, and I'm just going to interview them. And then Bloomberg saw it, and they said they'd put it on TV. So basically, I made myself into interviewer because you have a lot of intellectual curiosity, but you have to read and prepare and so forth. But everything I'm doing, I enjoy. And as you get older, and I'm now at an age I couldn't believe I would have got to. I remember when I was a boy looking at Dwight Eisenhower. Some of you may be my age or a little older. Dwight Eisenhower looked like an old man. I saw him, remember on television. John Kennedy was a young man. Eisenhower was old. Well, Eisenhower was elected president when he was 62. That's a teenager today, right? We'd love to have a president only 62. I'd say now I feel like I'm in a race to get things done before my brain collapses or my body collapses. As all of you know who've my age or around my age, you realize that you can't do everything you could do when you were in your 30s or 40s, and you know from looking at other people that your body can't do the things it once did, and the brain can't do the things it once did. But as long as you can do some things pretty well, race to get these things done before it's too late. So I'm racing to get things done. I call it, sprinting to the finish line. And I'm trying to get stuff done before, people are, saying you can't do this anymore. And I'm waiting for people to come to me and say, well, you did a good job as chairman here, but now you're not. In fact, somebody did that the other day. President Trump fired me. I was chairman of the Kennedy Center for 14 years, and President Trump not only fired me, he succeeded me. So the only person in the country's history who's been fired by a president and succeeded by him. But anyway, so, maybe if somebody will fire me for my other jobs, who knows?
Let's talk about something else that I know that you really, really enjoy. It's the concept of philanthropy. And you actually have created, I think, a new vertical in terms of patriotic philanthropy. Right. And you were featured on 60 Minutes a while ago talking about the things you've done with the Washington Monument and Jefferson Memorial. and so forth. You've also you're among the initial 40 people who have pledged to donate more than half their wealth as part of the Giving Pledge that was founded with Bill Gates and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that and what really inspired you to.
Well, when you grow up with no money, you don't think about philanthropy that much. So I really didn't know that much about it and hadn't given away much money because I didn't have much money. But when I started making money at Carlisle, I began to think about it. And when you have a fair amount of money by normal human standards, I don't have the money that Elon Musk has or Bill Gates has, but on normal human standards, I have a lot of money. What do you do with it? Well, you can die with it and be buried with it like the pharaohs did, but that's probably not a great thing to do. So then your other choices are you give it away to your children, which is mostly what people do. Most people give it away to their spouse or their children. That's okay, but you can ruin your children's lives by giving them too much money. My children may not agree with that, but so I didn't think that was a great idea to just give my money to my kids. Another possibility is you can do what a large number of people do. Most people do this. They give it away upon their death. And my theory was I wasn't going to be at some place where I could see where the money was being spent after I'm dead. So I thought I would rather give it away while I'm alive and get the pleasure of doing it. Now, what's the pleasure of it? Well, what makes people live? What's the purpose of life? Thomas Jefferson said life was about, in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. He never defined what happiness was in the ensuing 50 years of his life, but happiness presumably comes about mostly by helping other people. Your children, your spouse, but other people you may not know. And so I found that when I started giving away money and scholarships or other things, I felt happier about it. And happier people live longer than grumpy people. So maybe it was a way to preserve my life. How many grumpy people do you see who are 85 years old? Tend to be, if you're going to be older, you probably are happier. So as you did something to make yourself happier. So when I began to give away money, I felt I was doing something better. It made me happy. The patriotic philanthropy thing came about, like many things in life, by serendipity. I was giving away money to the schools I got scholarships from. I had scholarships everywhere I went. I was giving those money there and other kinds of normal things, hospitals, libraries, other kinds of things in areas I lived in. And I was living in Washington, a lot of money there. But then what happened was I was asked by somebody to go view a copy of the Magna Carta in New York. Now, I know what the Magna Carta was, but I wasn't that much of an expert in it. So I went to see it as a friend invited me. And I got there, and the very clever person, there was a curator of the Magna Carta, said, this is actually going to be an auction tomorrow night of the Magna Carta, the most famous document in Western history. And it's going to go to somebody from Russia or some other countries that they said were terrible countries that I didn't want that place to go to. They said, this is one of 17 copies of the Magna Carta, the only one in private hands, and the only one that will ever be in the United States. And I knew enough to know that Magna Carta was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and so forth. And so I said, well, okay, I understand. We should keep it in the country. And the curator said, yes, but we don't know who's going to win. We think it could be somebody from another country. So I said, okay. So I resolved in my mind to go back the next night and try to bid on it. And I didn't tell anybody because it sounds presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. And I didn't want to tell my children. They'd say, well, how much less money might this mean for us? So I didn't tell them. So I just went there, and I went to Sotheby's. I had never been there before, the night before. And I get there and say, okay, I'm here ready to bid on the Magna Carta. And they said, well, no, go in a little room, and we'll put you in a room. You'll be on a telephone. So I get in the room. They put me there, and they start bidding. And if any of you have ever been in one of these kind of situations, you listen to the bid, and I'm listening, and they kept saying, well, are you going to bid? Are you going to bid? And I kept saying, well, I don't know. And they said, look, it's going to end soon if you don't bid. And I said, well, okay, I'll bid. And I put a bid in, and 1 second later they said sold. So I wondered whether anybody actually bid against me. I don't know. So I bid, and then what happened was they said, you want to tell people who you are and what you're going to do with this? They actually came into the little room I was in. They said, we don't know who you are. Do you actually have the money for this? I said, I do. They said, okay, well, you can go. You can take it out the side door. Nobody will know. Or you can tell the reporters. And I said, I'm going to tell the reporters that I'm going to make this a gift to the United States as a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country, which has been so good to me. And then I started buying other historic documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, Declaration of Independence. I own more copies of the Declaration of Independence than anybody in this country, including the U.S. government. I lend my copies to the U.S. government. I've got about 15 very rare copies of the Declaration. And I have several copies of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Lincoln, 13th Amendment signed by Lincoln, which freed the slaves, rare copies of the Bill of Rights and Constitution, and I lend them out to places. And then as I started doing that, one time the Washington Monument had an earthquake. And there was an earthquake in Washington, the monument was damaged. As the chair of the Kennedy Center then, I asked the head of the Park Service, who was then on the board, who was going to fix it, where was the money going to come from. He said, I'll have to deal with Congress, it'll take me a couple years. So forget the Congress, I'll put up the money. And I was surprised that people were surprised that a private citizen would put up the money for it. He didn't want to deal with Congress. Later, Congress said they wanted some credit for doing something. Could they put him some money? I said, okay, I don't care. So, and then I did that, and then I started fixing other monuments. The Lincoln Memorial, which was falling apart at the time, the Jefferson Memorial, Mount Vernon, the house of Thomas Jefferson, Monticello, Montpelier, James Madison's house. Started fixing them up, and then I'll never forget when the Lincoln Memorial, I was sitting out there, and I announced the gift to fix the Lincoln Memorial, and the Park Service is sitting there, and we're sitting there. All of a sudden, it's covered live on C-SPAN, and all of a sudden, I'm sitting there. The park rangers are there, and they have their hats on, and then it starts to snow. And I'm sitting out there, and it's snowing before we make the announcement. So I get a call on my cell phone from my mother saying, David, put your hat on. So, but anyway, so the point of this is this. The human brain is an incredible instrument. When we first got on the face of the earth as Homo sapiens, roughly 400,000 years ago, we came out of caves 400,000 years ago after some interbreeding with the Neanderthals, but the Homo sapiens emerged, and when the tigers saw us, and the lions saw us, and the elephants saw us, they didn't pay attention to us. We weren't fast enough, big enough to scare them. They didn't care about us. But the reason we conquered the earth was because of the brain. We had a better brain than anybody else. And so that brain enabled us to do things like a Picasso painting, a Shakespeare play, a Stravinsky concert, all those kind of things that the human brain has done, Einstein theories, all the kind of things the human brain's done. But the human brain has not yet advanced to the point, it will at some point, where if you see something on a computer slide, it's the same experience as seeing it in person or in a real life situation. So if you want to look at the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence, you can go on a computer slide, and your brain will tell you what it is, and you'll see it, but you'll go to the next thing. If you actually go visit the real Magna Carta, you will probably read about it before you get there. You'll have a curator tell you something about it when you're there, and then afterwards you'll probably read about it. So it's a better experience for the human brain still to actually see something in person. So by preserving all of these things, I think more people will see them. And why is that important? Because historians have long said those people that don't remember history are condemned to relive it. And if we don't know much about our history, we're likely to make mistakes that we made before. And we don't know much about history now because we don't teach history very much anymore. In the year 2000, National Science Foundation studies came out and said, we're falling behind the Chinese, so we have to learn more science, technology, engineering, and math for our students, called STEM. And every parent was afraid that their child wouldn't get a job at Goldman Sachs or Google or someplace if their child wasn't a STEM major. So history majors went from 9% of undergraduates to about 2%, maybe 1.5% now. So we don't learn much about history. And a good example of this is that if you are a naturalized citizen, anybody here a naturalized American? Anybody? No. Okay, one. If you're a naturalized American, you have to take a citizenship test after 5 years of residence. And 91% of the Americans, prospective Americans pass that, 91%. The same test was given to native-born Americans in all 50 states about 3 years ago, and about 3.5 million people took that, and in only one state, Vermont, could a bare majority in that one state. Every other state, a majority of the citizens who are native-born couldn't pass the basic citizenship test that you have to take when you're trying to become a citizen. Which shows you, and these questions aren't difficult. Who's the first president of the United States? How many branches are there in the federal government? And so forth. We just don't teach history very much anymore. So my idea, and the whole point of what I'm trying to do, is to educate Americans more about history, and therefore maybe they'll not make the mistakes we made in the past. That's the point of it.
How do you keep all those documents safe? Do you keep those documents in your house?
No, I have no documents in my house. I have a very clever idea, which is my best idea of all time. I give them on a permanent loan, or 5-year, 10-year loan to the let's say the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Archives. They have guards guarding there, so I don't have to worry about somebody stealing them. I got guards, on government payroll, protecting my documents. So it's a pretty good technique, right?
Absolutely. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about the Orioles. If you could, David, walk us through your acquisition of the Orioles why did you buy them?
Okay.
What are your plans for the team? And how were you able to beat out people like Bill Miller, the stock guru? And I heard a bunch of other people that were really interested too. How did you make that?
Well, what happened was this. I was, as some of you may have read, I was a Little League baseball player and an all-star at the age of 9 or 10, and then I kind of peaked out at 10 or 11 and wasn't that good. And so I really wasn't that great an athlete. And I was an all-star when I was 8 or 9, and I thought maybe I will go into the pros, but I didn't realize it was a Jewish Little League, and maybe there were no Sandy Koufaxes in that league, so I was hitting very weak pitching. So I petered out as probably 9 years old as an athlete, and I didn't pay that much attention to it because I wasn't that good at it. I did other stuff. And then what happened is I went to Washington, stayed there, built my firm, got involved in philanthropy, and then what happened was I had read that the Orioles might be for sale, and I talked to some friends, maybe I should look at it as an investment to give back to Baltimore, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then Ted Leonsis, who owns the Washington Caps and the Washington Wizards, used to be called the Baltimore Clippers and Baltimore Bullets, some of you may remember that. They were moved to Washington by Abe Poland, and Ted had bought it, and he said he would like to buy the Orioles. He heard that I was interested, and he said, why don't I team up with him? And he already owned 2 teams, and I could go in with him. And so I let him sort of try to negotiate a deal. He was of Greek ancestry, and the owners of the Orioles were of Greek ancestry, and he thought maybe he had a good relationship with them, and he thought he had once previously agreed to get an agreement to buy the Orioles, but didn't work out. So I said, okay, if you can do it, I'll maybe invest in your company then, and I'll own 3 teams with you, but he'll still be the majority owner. The negotiation didn't go very far, and it fell apart. And at that point, John Angelos came to see me, and I'd met him just once. He came to see me in Nantucket, where I have a home, last summer, 2 summers ago, and he said, look, you were interested in the Orioles, why don't you just buy a minority stake for me, 10% or something? And I said, well, okay, maybe. And then I thought about it, if you're a minority stake in a team, you're really a season ticket holder. I mean, you don't really have any things to do, and if things don't go right, you're going to get blamed. And so I said, okay, maybe I went back to him and said, maybe if I could have a path to control down the road. Your family hasn't said it's going to sell, but if you ever do sell, I could have a, kind of a priority chance to buy it. Maybe not quite a first refusal, but a chance to buy it. And he said, well, let me think about it. And he came back one weekend to my surprise and said, okay, I'll do it, but I'll sell control now. So wait a second, I didn't think I got to go line up the money and everything. I thought I was going to put in some money, and now I got to put in a lot more. So okay, but I said, okay, I'll do it. And then we negotiated over a while. I walked away at one point on Christmas, 2 Christmas ago. I wasn't happy in negotiations. I walked away, but ultimately I decided to go ahead and do it. And the reason I did it was not because I expect to make that much money, if any money on it. It's really because I thought that I'd grown up in Baltimore. My parents grew up here. My parents were married here. They raised me here. They're buried here. I was raised here. I got a public school education, and I will be buried in Baltimore also. And I thought I should do more for Baltimore than I've done. I'm on the board of Johns Hopkins Medicine. I've been on the board of Johns Hopkins University, and I've given money to the Hopkins Medical, but I probably haven't done as much for Baltimore as I thought maybe I should have done. And so I thought this was a way to maybe help revive the Orioles. And the Orioles, I thought by reviving the Orioles, if I could help Baltimore, because probably no other city in the major leagues has as close a relationship with its team as Baltimore does. Baltimore doesn't have as many of the things as Los Angeles or New York or Houston or Chicago. They have so many other things going on for those cities. We don't have quite as many things in Baltimore. And the Baltimore Orioles are really a really important part of the fabric and DNA of the city. So I thought if I could help re-energize it, maybe it could help re-energize Baltimore. And therefore, I saw it as more as a philanthropic gesture, though obviously I'm not looking to lose money, but I didn't really see it as my highest, best use of money to make profit.
You also talked about, we read in the media that you had plans to, because of your advanced age, as you put it,
right.
You wanted to accelerate the success of the Orioles and bring home a World Series sooner than later.
Well, I hope so. We've been in 6 World Series, we've won 3. And, but we haven't been to World Series since 1983, right. And, it's easy to say that talk is always cheap, but, owners rarely can make that much of a difference, particularly the way the rules are set up in baseball now. It's difficult. But I'm with my partners, I'm in a financial position to do pretty much anything we want to do. I'm not an expert in players, obviously. People that have been doing this their whole life are people we're relying on. So Mike Elias, our general manager, he's really, really good. He won General Manager of the Year, I think, 2 years ago. And they have everything in algorithm kind of format, so they can tell you what a player's worth and in 5 years, and 3 years, 2 years. And so we rely on these algorithms to figure out what we should pay people, but we're not starved for cash, and we're prepared to pay people a fair bit. In fact, this year, I think this year, we will have the second or maybe the first or second highest increase percentage-wise in payroll. I think we went from 101 to maybe 165 million in payroll, which is, for a percentage increase, is maybe either first or second highest in baseball. So we're prepared to spend the money. We're also prepared to work with the state to fix the stadium, and we'll have some of the improvements you'll see at the time of the opening day, and next off season we'll dramatically redo Camden Yards, which is now more than 30 years old.
42 years since the last World Series. We hope we have one coming up soon. Also, great move, and I'm going to open up to the audience in a second for questions. Great move, David, in the paper last month. Orioles to roll out value menu, Camden Yards with $5 beer,
right,
$4 hot dog. You no longer need to get a second mortgage to go to a baseball game.
Well,
great move with that.
What it is John Angelos was effectively the CEO of the business side, and he did it with not a lot of money coming from the family. He kind of inherited it. When his father became ill, John took it over and ran it for about 5 years, I think it was, and but there wasn't a lot of cash to put in, and he did a lot of things by himself. When we bought it, we decided that John would be leaving, obviously, and therefore we would have to get a person to run the business side. We recruited Katie Griggs, who was the equivalent person at the Seattle Mariners, a person who had grown up in North Carolina, wanted to come back to the East Coast, going to Dartmouth, had played soccer at Dartmouth, went to business school at Dartmouth, very talented person. And she's been hiring a whole bunch of new people that kind of make our business side as good as our playing side. So we've got a pretty good team, but we have now a really good front office. And they're looking at the food and the food situation. On that particular thing, now the way they have structured it is, if you want to get a drink, you pay whatever the drink fee is, $4, I guess. But then you can get unlimited refills, and so you don't have to stand in line and go buy another one. You just take your cup back and just fill it up yourself. And I hope that won't contribute to overweight problems. But anyway, so we do that, and we're changing the food menu a bit. We've made some changes over the season. As you all know, the left field wall is coming in a bit. Right. We hope that'll help our home runs, but if it doesn't, we'll move it out again. No, we won't. And then we've improved the sound. The sound system is not as great as it should be. We've improved that now, and then we will, in the next off season, we'll fix the scoreboard. We'll have a much more modern scoreboard, and then in the next off season, we'll change the seating a bit and do a whole bunch of other things to make the stadium as good as stadiums are around the rest of the country. Remember, when this was open, it revolutionized baseball when the stadium was open. And every stadium built since then has kind of modeled itself after what Camden Yards did. But now we're 30 years behind, and so we have some features we have to add to be as good as other stadiums.
Tremendous stadium, and hopefully we'll have an all-star game here soon as well. Who's got a question?
I think we will.
Yes, sir.
But I'm wondering, what do you do in your spare time?
I do interviews like this. I'm here in my spare time. Now, when my spare time, look, I have 3 children who are grown. They're all in private equity, so I have the highest calling of mankind they're pursuing. They live in different parts of the country, so seeing them takes some time. And now I got 3 grandchildren, another one coming very soon, so I have some grandchildren. In my spare time, I read a lot. I just love reading, and I do a lot of interviews because when you reach a certain age, you always worry about where your brain's going to go atrophy. And there's no perfect way. There are some medical things you can't overcome. There's some genetic predispositions to Alzheimer's. You can't overcome some of them. There's some other things you can do. Nothing's going to really work. But sometimes people tell you that you keep your brain active. So they say learn crossword puzzles. I can't do those well. Learn a foreign language. I have no language skills. Do a musical instrument. I'm tone deaf. I couldn't do that. So I kind of do interviewing a bit in my spare time to keep my brain active. And I find that I'm being interviewed a lot, and I do interviewing, and in interviewing, I did one this morning with the head of the World Bank in Washington. To prepare, it takes some time, and then you have to read a lot. And then when you write a book, you have to actually prepare for it. And I write a lot of articles as well. So I just try to keep my brain active, and that's my spare time. And my biggest problem is I'm not as svelte as I like to be. I've noticed that when you eat a lot, it tends to show up around the stomach area. So I got to exercise a little bit more. And I did this summer. This spring break, I was down in the Orioles, and we had some of our investors came down, and I got in the batting cage, and Brandon Hyde was looking at me, was standing there, and Cal Ripken's there, and I actually hit a couple balls, and they couldn't believe that somebody my age could hit the ball out of the infield. They were ground balls, but still they're out of the infield. And then one time they gave me a glove. It was too big for my hand probably, and they put me in shortstop, and then a hard grounder came, and I looked the other way. I put my glove down, and the ball went in the glove, and they couldn't believe it, and I couldn't believe it either. So maybe I have more athletic skills. Maybe I should get on the diamond a little bit more. But I try to exercise as much as I can, and my theory is if you buy a lot of exercise equipment, eventually it might by osmosis rub off. I don't know if that works, but
It's a good thought. Also, I saw your interview with Tim Cook, chairman of Apple, and
Yes.
you tried a new thing with that interview. You tried an interview without your tie. He really
Right.
appreciated it.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the few people who still wear ties. I bought a lot of ties years ago, and I'm amortizing them over the next 10 years. And so now, if I bought all these ties, and now the tie person I was buying them from is Hermes. They now don't make these anymore. You have thin ties. As men know, sometimes you have thin ties, you have wide ties, and I think it's a plot to have you buy more ties because you have to feel your ties are out of style. So now my ties are out of style, but I still have some thin ones. I haven't gotten used to wearing them yet, but I still wear ties. And my father hated ties. I don't know where I got this from. My father hated ties. He would never wear a tie, and when I had to wear a tie, he didn't know how to tie it, so I had to go next to a neighbor and get it fixed out how to get the tie. But eventually, I learned how to do it, and I'm happy with where I am in my life. I just wish I was, younger, and I just wish I could get the World Series quicker. But hope springs eternal, and we'll see what we can do this year.
Yeah, but then there's Warren Buffett, who's 94, still kicking, and his partner Charlie Munger, who I guess was 99 when he died. So there's
Yes,
much more.
I was with Warren recently. He asked me to, when I was still the chairman of the Kennedy Center, he asked if I could arrange a time to have a woman he knew very well, Katharine Graham, a documentary shown at the Kennedy Center, which we did a couple weeks ago. And Warren was there, 94 years old, pretty sharp. Walks with a cane now, but 94, I'd be happy to be alive, and let alone walk with a cane. So he's in pretty good shape.
Other questions? Ken?
Well, first I want to thank you so much for being here. And
Sure.
Jeff, thank you for putting this on. This is great. You talk about serving young people. And in business, and these are entrepreneurs here, finding capital is so difficult. What do you recommend for startups? Because they don't have access to capital through private equity.
Right.
But there's so many young people that are aggressive, sharp, and want to make a success
Right.
of themselves, but they can't get the capital.
Well, raising capital, look, I have 3 children who have private equity funds, and I'm teaching them how to go raise money because you have to ask. I mean, I had never asked people for money before. When I started Carlyle, I have to start asking people for money. And, I hate when people say, I hate to ask you for money, because if you hate doing it, don't do it. But, in fundraising, there are 3 types of ways to do it. There's fundraising for philanthropic purposes, and that's okay. It's a little complicated because you're not giving people money back, but you're making them feel like they're going to get to heaven more quickly. Then there's fundraising for, business ventures, and then there's fundraising for political ventures, for campaigns. I think the best one to do, and the easiest, is for business ventures, because you have a promise that maybe people are going to make their money and get some money back. But there's nothing short of asking people, and when I started doing it, I started with a concentric circle of people I knew, and then people that they introduced me to, and it always, it's a little nerve-wracking when you have people you start talking to them, and they say, this might not be for me, but I know somebody else you should talk to. When they are always giving you to their friends, that means that probably they're never going to invest with you. But in the end, if you have a good track record, the word will spread. So I'm always raising money for people still, for my firms. And I think you have to start by asking people who you know, and then ask them for introductions. And people sometimes, to get rid of you, will give you introductions. And then have a good set of materials and actually know what you're talking about. So, and I also think it's important to follow up. You can't have a meeting and think somebody's going to say, oh yes, I really was looking for something like this today. Where did I write the check? That never happens. You've got to follow up and appropriately follow up in a timely manner. A good meeting with a business person you're trying to get as an investor has a half-life of about 2 weeks. If you haven't followed up and had some contact in about 2 weeks subsequent to the meeting, probably is not going to happen. So you got to make sure you follow up. And then, of course, nothing works as well as having a good returns. When you give people back their money, they love it, and they can get more money. But it just takes time. And there are more venture funds and other things you can go to today than there used to be, but it's not easy. Sorry.
Other questions? Stevie?
Amy, thanks for being here. A question I have is, running private equity firms, you're buying businesses, you're turning them around. Early on when you started your firm, knowing that, people would be laid off, there's like a human aspect to this. Did you ever struggle with that at all? Was that hard for you?
Well, I didn't struggle with it because I didn't think it was actually true. If you look at the statistics, more people, percentage-wise, are laid off in companies that are publicly traded companies that have nothing to do with private equity. So people are laid off all the time. And so private equity firms, in the early days, though, of private equity, they did do what you might call as a slash and burn approach. And that meant, for those who aren't buyout experts, in the early days of buyouts, you basically, to be honest, you put in 1% equity and you borrowed 99% of the purchase price. And Eli Jacobs, who was an owner of the Orioles, he was a very well-known guy that did that with the Orioles. He didn't put a lot of equity in, and so when he had business problems, it never went into bankruptcy. Subsequent to the 1% and 5% equity components in buyouts, when they kind of went bad in the late 80s, the equity component went up to about 40 to 50%. So today, the chance of these deals going under and people having to be laid off because they went under is remote. There's no doubt that in the early days as well, what you did is you would reduce the staff, cut the costs, and increase the EBITDA. Today, EBITDA growth is what people tend to focus on, which is to say we're going to grow the company and we're not just going to shrink it and then show a higher EBITDA because expenses are down. So today, I think it's not as true as it once was. It was a problem in the early days, but we didn't really have that problem. We had some companies that didn't work, but generally we have now, Carlyle has roughly 1 million employees at the companies we control. So you add up all the ones we have, it's about 1 million employees. And generally they're pretty happy and they generally make money and we give them a piece of the business, but not every business works, of course. But I didn't, I had a lot of things I anguished over. That probably wasn't one of them.
It's interesting because the Wall Street Journal used to talk about Chainsaw Al. Remember the guy that bought Sunbeam?
Yes.
He used to come in and just use the
there
chainsaw.
There were people who did that. Now we have Chainsaw Elon, right?
Right.
I think people got carried away with the image of cutting costs and so forth. That isn't the way we tend to make money these days in the buyout world. And as you know, the buyout world's changed. It used to be called buyouts, but now it's so many different types of private capital. So there's growth capital, venture capital, private credit is a gigantic business. We have more money under private credit now than we do in private equity at Carlyle. So we've changed a bit, but there's no doubt that business is a risk and everything doesn't work out. And I've made a lot of investments that seem great personally myself. I invest with other people and then they call me and say, well, this just didn't work out. And this a couple of them I've made investments in it seemed like I couldn't lose money and then I lost money. So.
Well, back then also there was the big days of the junk bond with Michael Milliken. And
Mike Milliken had invented a junk bond. He's a friend of mine. I know him quite well. He invented the junk bond, and he invented money. Because if he gave you a letter that said, I'm highly confident I can raise money for you, that was as good as money. And, he's a pretty smart guy, and he may have gotten in trouble at one point, but he's been pardoned by the president, but he's done a great job in philanthropy, there's no doubt about it.
he paid a big fine, and he still had $500 million, I think, after he paid his fine.
In '87, his income was said to be $500 million in '87, and that was a lot of money then, a lot of money now. But he's a very smart guy, there's no doubt about it.
Charles.
But I really want to talk about baseball. We have Adley Rushman, Gunnar, maybe a few pitchers or whatever. How are we need to lock those guys up because and pay them what you think you can get away with. And because we don't want to deal with Boras
I understand.
after, when their time's up and Boras gets sniffing around there. I mean, it's going to be a tough negotiation. And are we going to get some sort of cap? Are the owners, I know the owners are looking for it. You think we'll have some sort of cap? Because Los Angeles spends $750 million for a player, and I mean, they spend probably $1 billion on different players.
I need my bell. Anybody got my bell?
Well, let me say, I am not unaware of the situation. And you're not the first person who told me that we should try to lock up these players. It's not as easy as you would like. And for those who don't follow baseball inside out, the way baseball more or less works is that you go to the minor leagues more or less for 1 or 2 years. You get a contract that's not that rich, but reasonable compared to what it used to be 25 years ago. And then when you're in the major leagues, for the first 6 years, you are subject to staying in that team. And the first 3 of those 6 years, you can go to arbitration with your own team on your salary. When you get to the end of 6 years, you become a free agent, and then you can go to anybody. And that's what Juan Soto did, and that's what Ohtani did, and so forth. The league has looked at this. I don't want to speak for the league. I'll just say we're familiar with the issue, and we'll see what happens. But in terms of those particular players, we're not unfamiliar with the desire of everybody, including the people on the team, to have them stay as long as they could in Baltimore and be like Brooks Robinson was here his whole career, Jim Palmer was here his whole career, Cal Ripken was here his whole career. I don't want to get in trouble by saying something that's going to get me in trouble, so I'll just say I'm not unfamiliar with your situation that you talk about, and I'm working as hard as I can to do something about it, but I just don't have anything to announce today. I'm sorry. But anyway, I'm familiar with it.
Marty.
David, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us.
Right.
You made a comment that you bought the Orioles partially to help Baltimore.
Right.
Baltimore is really struggling right now.
I know.
What do we do? What do you see that we can do in town to really get Baltimore back to where it needs to be?
Baltimore, when I grew up and I was growing up, Baltimore was the 9th biggest city in the United States population-wise. Population about 930,000 people. It was 9th or 8th or 9th biggest in the country. We're now not even in the top 20. And one of the reasons for that, and as all of you are probably familiar with it, is that the legislature, it used to be the case, Baltimore City was gobbling up part of Baltimore County. And what is now part of Baltimore City used to be part of Baltimore County. I think it was in 1922 that the legislature basically put a ban on that and said Baltimore City cannot gobble up more of Baltimore County. And so Baltimore County basically became a separate jurisdiction. And Baltimore is one of the only 2 cities in the United States where the main city is not in a county. Baltimore City is not in a county, and St. Louis is not in a county. And therefore, the way it works here is that when you leave Baltimore City to move to Baltimore County or some other surrounding county, the tax base goes away 100%. And that has been a big problem because as the tax base has gone away, Baltimore has suffered. So when Baltimore had like 939,000 people when I was growing up, today I think the population is maybe 500,000, but it's now, the white flight is dramatic. So the population of Baltimore is today roughly 62% African American, and which is fine. It's just that unfortunately the African American part of the population is not the highest income part of Baltimore, and therefore a lot of the tax base is going to Baltimore County. And there's no easy answer for it. I think the corporate headquarters have moved out. Today, there are very few corporate headquarters. They are T. Rowe Price.
Exelon.
I'm sorry?
Exelon.
Exelon, and a lot of it's elsewhere. And then McCormick and Kevin Plank's company, Under Armour. But there aren't that many corporate headquarters. A lot of them moved out, or a lot have been merged away. And you've got the white flight problem. You've got some crime. There's no doubt that there's been a lot of crime in Baltimore over the years. Some TV shows highlighted it, and I think it hurt the image of the city. You've had some politicians who weren't as honest as maybe they should be, and that hurt the image of the city as well. So Baltimore has problems. Now, no one person, me or anybody, can solve all those problems. I think you've got now a really good mayor and a really good governor. They can make some difference, but I think getting corporate headquarters to come back in would be very helpful if we could find ways to do that. Getting people to want to move back in to the city, when your children are now grown and now you don't need as much land to maybe keep your kids happy. Moving back into the city will be good, I think, and I hope the Orioles and the Ravens, if they do as well as I hope they can do, that might draw more attention to it. But there's no easy answer for sure. Very few cities have turned around that quickly. Now, Baltimore is somewhat similar to Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, other urban areas that really, I think, atrophied for a while. Now Detroit is coming back a bit, Cleveland's coming back a bit. I think Baltimore hopefully can come back. We've got some good political leaders now, and we've got some good business leaders as well. I hope that it can happen, but there's no easy answer for sure. On philanthropy, I'm, inundated every day with philanthropic requests. There's no lack of requests in Baltimore, and I've done some, and I'll highlight one on Sunday. I'll coming back for something that I'm doing downtown Baltimore, and there's some more that I'll hopefully announce soon. But I'm only one person, and I'm 75 years old, so it's got to be younger people than me that can really turn it around a bit. But it's a challenge for sure. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I think people I talk to, people are afraid to go downtown. They hear about carjackings and
it's a problem. I mean, the crime is a problem. Baltimore has had a high, historically, a very high crime rate, murder rate, STD rate, illiteracy rate. I wish it wasn't the case. But Washington has some of the similar problems. Washington has the federal government, supporting it to some extent. When Baltimore doesn't quite have that. Of course, we thought they had the federal government in Washington. We'll find out what's going to be left of it soon. But I try to do the most as I can, and I'm trying to. For example, in the Orioles, the owner's box was not really filled that much before. I have it filled. It's the 55 seats. I have every time I have it filled. When I have it filled with people from the community as well, not just wealthy business people, but little leaguers, people who never get a chance to sit in an owner's box or go onto the field. And I'm trying to inspire younger people to kind of get involved with the Orioles, get involved with the city, and try to make it a place that they're proud of. And I try to do that in Washington, and I've done that for a number of years with scholarships and other programs, and I'll look at some things I can do here, but I'm only one person, obviously.
Rob.
I love the term curious intellect, right? And just a lifelong learner. What book, podcast, or piece of content have you consumed recently that has really changed your thinking?
Well, I love reading, and lots of books inspired me. I was inspired by President Kennedy and the great inaugural address he gave in 1961. But books I try to read. I try to read 100 books a year.
Wow.
And I have it's a trick. I have a trick to it, which is I'm interviewing authors a lot. So to do that, you have to read the book. And I expect to announce soon a new TV show that'll be on C-SPAN called America's Book Club. There I will, in the evenings, on live evenings, we'll do it, if I can work out the schedule, where I'll interview the most famous authors in the United States on C-SPAN. And C-SPAN's had book programs, but I hope to make it different. And I have a program at the Library of Congress where I interviewed an author in front of members of Congress once a month. And I love doing that because I pay for the dinner, and I invite members from the House and Senate to come, and they come, and I love it because they don't usually talk to people from the opposite House, the opposite part of the Congress, because they don't usually do that, and they don't see each other that much anymore. And also, if you're a Republican, you're not supposed to talk to Democrats and vice versa. So they now come, no press is there, they come and they learn something about American history. My theory was, who should learn more about American history, though, than the people making the legislature? And I do that a lot. I read the books, and I just did one the other night. And I'll tell you, one time I interviewed John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States. And I said to him, and I've known him, I was the chairman of the Smithsonian, he was the chancellor, and we spent a lot of time together. And I said, look, I'd like members of Congress to learn more how the court works. And he said, okay. I said, can I interview you in front of members of Congress? We got about 300 members of Congress there, and they came, and it was a great program. And I'll tell you one thing he said. I said at the beginning, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States when you were a little boy? He said, no. But did you want to be a judge? No. Did you want to be a lawyer? No. What did you want to be? I wanted to study American history. All I cared about was American history. I loved American history, and I wanted to be a teacher of American history and writer of books about American history.
Wow.
And John's father said, John, you'll starve to death. There's no money there. You got to get a profession, be a lawyer, doctor, something. And John said, I don't care about it. I just want to study American history. So he didn't listen to his father. He went to Harvard, and he majored in American history. He came back from spring break one day, gets off the airport, Logan Airport in Boston, and gets into a cab and says to the cab driver, can you take me to Cambridge? And he said, yes. And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in American history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. And so John got out of that. But I do that, and in terms of books, I'm not a big fiction book person. I like nonfiction. I can understand it, but I just learn a lot. And I don't know if there's any one book, but I just like books about humans who've come back and done something great for the country or or done something great for civilization, and came from very modest circumstances. And those are the kind of books I often like to talk to people about. And I try to, some of the books I've written, are really, I take the interviews I've done and I kind of put them together and try to inspire people by doing that.
How do you decide what books you're going to read? You read about approximately 2 books a week. How do you?
Well, usually I have a couple programs around the country where I'm interviewing people, so the programs they'll say, well, would you interview this person about this book and that book? And so they send me the books and I start reading them. And, I can read pretty quickly. But I can, if it was a book about science or math, I wouldn't get through the books. If I'm reading a book about history, biography, I know this stuff pretty well by now, and I can get through it pretty quickly, so it's not that hard.
Other question? Charlie?
David, thanks for everything you're doing for Baltimore. I am interested, if it's appropriate, to hear more about the Kennedy Center.
Yes.
You devoted so many years of your
Yes.
life to that, and I thank you for that as an American.
Yes.
Do you personally, has your exit been tough personally, and are you still energized to give back as much as you have?
Well, the Kennedy Center, I have given more money to things named after President Kennedy than anybody in the country. I'm the biggest donor to the Kennedy Center. I've given them $120 million. I've probably given about $75 million to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and a fair amount of money to the Kennedy Library, which is named after President Kennedy. And I really was inspired by him and went into public service because of him. And the Kennedy Center, I was first put on the board by George W. Bush, and then later became the chairman. I was on the board for 20 years, chairman for 14, the longest of any chairman. And I gave them, I say, about $120 million. And I think I changed it a lot. What happened was, as I understand it, is that when the first time President Trump was president, the first year it was after Charlottesville, some of the honorees, Lionel Richie particularly, and Norman Lear, didn't want to go to the White House to shake Trump's hand after the statements from Charlottesville. I had to call President Trump, who I've known for a while, and I told him they didn't want to come, and he said, well, I'm not coming to the gala, and that went on for a couple years that way. I had dinner with him over the summer. He didn't mention this to me. He hadn't been elected yet. And I had dinner with him because I wanted to interview him on a book I was doing the presidency, and he agreed to give me an interview. And I did the interview. I did it an hour or so before he was on trial that day. And then I think what happened was somebody, I don't want this to be recorded, so I probably, somebody, I know who it is, but I won't say. Somebody was complaining that he hadn't gotten a Kennedy Center honor because he was a political conservative, and he complained to President Trump about that. And then President Biden put some people on the White House staff on the Kennedy Center board right before he left office. I think that President Trump wasn't happy about that. And then it turns out somebody said to him that there had been a drag show at the Kennedy Center. I didn't know about it. There are 2,000 programs a year. I don't know every one of them. And it might have been a drag show. I now understand it was a comedy show or something, said adults only. But, President Trump had never been to the Kennedy Center. He went the other day for the first time. He had never been. And, what he said is he would like to, change a lot of things. He wants to give away the Kennedy Center honors, and he'd like to be in charge of it, he said. And he wanted to give it to somebody from Baltimore, you may have read. He wants to give it to Babe Ruth, which had not been an entertainer that I'd popped into my mind. But he's going to change it, and I'm okay with what happened. I mean, he's the President of the United States. I'm not, nobody has ever been fired by a president and succeeded by him at the same time. So he fired me, and he took the job as well. So when I went to see him recently, he invited me in to see him recently to talk about it. And I went to see him, and he said, what do you think of the way I've decorated the Oval Office? And I said, well, you got a lot of portraits here of presidents. He said, yeah. I said, where'd you get them all from? He said, I got them from the National Gallery of Art. And I said, well, you know, I'm the chairman of that too. Do you want that job also? He said, I don't know, should I? I don't know. So I don't know, maybe be chairman of the National Gallery of Art, I don't know. But in any event, don't tell him about your job, you might want this job too. So I don't know.
We could work a deal.
I'm okay, look, 14 years is a long time to be chair. I pretty much did what I wanted to do, and I built some new buildings there, and there was one more thing I was going to do, which is to build an outdoor amphitheater, but somebody else will do it, I guess, and it's okay. You know, life goes on. I mean, you know, I'm not in jail, and I didn't, you know, get thrown out of the country, so I'm okay.
If my math is correct, David, you're approximately, I guess, 14 years old when Kennedy got shot. Well,
Yeah.
what was it about him that inspired you so much that,
Well,
you know, it's...
Okay, if some of you might be my age, you might remember this. On January the 20th, 1961,
Right.
The weather was terrible in Washington. It was so cold that you could see the
Snowing.
breath coming out of their mouths. The schools were closed. I was in the 6th grade, and I watched the address. I didn't really understand it that much. And then the next day, my teacher in Falstaff Elementary got a text of the speech, and we went through it line by line, and I didn't quite understand it, but she was explaining the lines to us, and I realized it was quite an unusual speech. It was very short relative to inaugural addresses, and the reason it was successful was because it was relatively short. It never used the word I. It didn't talk about, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It talked about the future. It used the word God at the end, which is often done in famous speeches, the Martin Luther King speech and the Gettysburg Address all make references to God at the end. And it talked about pulling the country together and inspiring people. And I just, ultimately, when I was so inspired by the speech, when I went to practice law, I went to work for the man who wrote that speech. And his name was Ted Sorensen. Now, there was some dispute about who actually wrote the speech. And President Kennedy wanted people to think he wrote it because he was being criticized for not having been intellectually sharp enough. And so to make sure people thought he wrote it, it was written by Ted Sorensen, who was really the speechwriter, and obviously Kennedy reviewed it and so forth. And Kennedy's view always was, as was Sorensen's, whoever gives the speech, it's their speech, not the speechwriter's speech. But that all said, FDR didn't write his inaugural address where he said, only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So it was written by a Columbia professor, but then FDR took the speech that Raymond Moley, the Columbia professor, had written and wrote it out in handwriting. And later it was sold for a lot of money. Kennedy remembered that and mentioned it to Sorensen at one point, and he kind of thought maybe I should have some of my handwriting. So what he did is when the speech was pretty much done, he was flying back from Palm Beach to Washington to give the inaugural address just 2 days in advance. While he's on his plane, he calls back Hugh Sidey, the Time magazine correspondent for the White House, and said, Hugh, I'm working on my speech. What do you think about it? Here's a draft. And Hugh Sidey saying, wait a second, the guy's going to be inaugurated in 2 days. He's still writing by hand his speech, and he's asking me, as a writer, what I think about it. I mean, this is hard to believe. But Hugh Sidey fell for it. He wrote an article after the inaugural address came out saying, I know President Kennedy wrote it. I saw it in his own handwriting. Well, it was a trick. What he had is the speech was already typed up. He then took 2 pages, wrote it in his handwriting, and then showed it to him. And Hugh Sidey thought that that was just an indication of part of the speech he'd written, but he'd written the whole thing. Anyway, I thought the speech was a great speech, and all of you may remember the famous signature line. Kennedy liked to be like Churchill, which is to have a signature line that everybody remember. So the signature line is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that was what made the speech so famous. And Churchill used to do the same thing all the time. And it was just a speech that kind of inspired me and many of my people, my generation, want to go into government and serve and so forth. And so I remember the speech well. It was at the end of it by saying, with a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. And it was a great way to end the speech. Great speech.
Beautiful, beautiful. Got time for 1 or 2 questions. Dan.
Fascinated by your collection of historic documents.
Yes.
Do you have a prized possession, one that you absolutely are, that's your favorite in the whole collection? And I guess the second part of that, is there a document out there floating around somewhere that you'd love to be able to get your hands on to purchase?
Well, I have the only copy in private hands of the Magna Carta, so that's pretty unusual, and it will always stay in here. I mean, when I die, it'll go to the National Archives. Put it on permanent loan there now, but when I die, they'll get it. Hopefully not for a while. I own a lot of copies, I mentioned, of the Declaration of Independence, and some very rare ones, and a lot of rare copies of the Bill of Rights. And there's some things that you can't get. For example, the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln wrote 2 of them in his own handwriting before he gave the speech. He read from one of them, and then he wrote 3 signature copies. And there are only 5 of them. 2 are at the Library of Congress, one's in the White House, one's at the Lincoln Museum in Springfield, and one's at Cornell University. They probably are not going to come up for sale. But you never know. People come up, people sell things all the time. People are always calling me with something unusual. And I have a large collection. In terms of Baltimore, I just got a call the other day and I bought it. There was a copy of the first letter that was written to somebody who wanted to buy or start a team in Baltimore. It was from the 1800s. The first Baltimore Orioles were actually in the 1800s. And the letter from somebody who was asking permission to buy or have the franchise, I bought that letter. And then I also have in Baltimore, I have more copies than anybody in the country of things related to the Star Spangled Banner. So many of those things were written out, and they were first printing of them, first American printing, first English printing, and so forth. And I figure out what to do with them all, but I have all those. It was always something. People always call me with something new, and sometimes they were fake. So after I bought the Magna Carta, I started getting people calling me and saying, well, if you want to spend that much money for a Magna Carta, I have one, and I have one. So you have to be careful. There are a lot of fakes, but anyway, the trick is figuring out what to do with all the documents, because I have them in display in places, but ultimately my children have zero interest in it. So I have one of the largest collections of historic books in the United States, more copies of the federal papers than anybody in the country, including the U.S. government. And I haven't figured out what to do with all them yet either. But anyway.
Final question, David. Looking back on your career, what's the one thing that you would have done differently in your life, and why?
Well, if I had been a better shortstop, I could have been what Cal Ripken had done. I should have stayed with it. No, I have rather regrets. I think I should have built Carlisle into a better organization than it was. It's one of the biggest in the world, but it should have been the biggest. I wish I had been a better public servant in the White House, and I was very close to Carter, but I didn't do as good enough job. We had high inflation, a whole bunch of other things. I prepared him for the debate. That didn't work very well. In the end, when most people, when you get to the end of their life, the only thing they tend to regret more is this: they didn't spend more time with their children. So, my children have all gotten great educations. They all went to great schools: Harvard, Stanford, Duke, and they're all in private equity. But I probably should have spent more time with them, and maybe they would be better private equity investors. Who knows? But I'm pretty happy, and I don't have my biggest thing is I should have taken better care of myself. I wish I had been exercising more and maybe eating more healthily and not drinking Diet Cokes or eating hot dogs so much or other things. But I'm trying to atone for all that now. But anyway, look, I appreciate everybody's coming here, and I'm trying to do the best I can to help the Orioles. I mean, I'm only one person, but all of you can pitch in as well. And I think all of you just think about what you can do to help Baltimore in some ways, and maybe make Baltimore the city that we all want it to be, and hopefully come to see the Orioles from time to time. And if any of you come to see the Orioles and you want to see me at the game, just let me know. Suite 33. I'll be there a lot of the games, okay? Thanks very much.
David Rubenstein, everybody.